There's a new paper out today from the School of Public Policy, the University of Calgary, examining whether or not the BC government should go ahead with Site C, which has turned into a train wreck of epic proportions. There are now technical problems, cost overruns. It's yet again another nightmare. So should the government eat $5 or $6 billion and can the project, or should it keep going? So what this did is it took a look at it a different way. It used a different set of metrics, a different measuring stick, if you will. So normally it's the levelized cost of energy, which is all of the costs amortized over however long you think that dam is going to last. 40, 50 years is the usual length of time. And at that rate, the current levelized cost of energy is about $100 a megawatt or 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's expensive electricity. That's, wind and solar are down in the 3 or 4 cent range right now. So if you judged it on the basis of levelized cost of energy, you would say that you probably should not go ahead with the dam. But Professor Kent Fellows and his co-authors took a different view of it, and they say maybe it makes sense to go ahead. So welcome to the interview, Kent.
Always a pleasure.
Now, look, I think this is a very useful paper that you've produced, because it gives us it looks at the project through a different lens. And God knows this project has been looked at through a lot of lenses, but I don't think this one. So explain your net present value analysis.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I mean, a lot of the current evaluation sort of compares costs of different technologies. And so we had the report by a colleague of mine, Blake Schaefer, a couple of weeks ago that looked at different costs for wind and solar and how much of those have fallen. What we're trying to do, and what we've done here, is we've looked at a value metric. So not what is the electricity cost compared to other sources of electricity, but what should we value it as? And that's a different question, because the electricity that we get out of something like Site C is dispatchable. We can choose when we're running water through the dam or not. And you can also use it as storage. When it's not running, that reservoir fills up behind the dam. When it is running, you're drawing down the reservoir. And so when you start factoring those things in and think about how the dam fits within the wider context of Alberta and BC's generation profile and transmission profile, can we actually get the electricity somewhere else? You get a different answer.
See, now you just raised probably the key point here, Kent, which is Alberta and BC, because Site C normally gets viewed within BC's boundaries only. And there's more and more talk about viewing Canada as at minimum two electricity markets. So from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC, and then Quebec and Ontario east. And if you look at them as a regional market, then the value of the hydro dams, for all of the reasons you just mentioned, it coupled with wind and solar from southern Alberta, which can be done very, very cheap, like probably 3 cents a kilowatt hour by now, then those dams have an entirely different value proposition. Have I kind of explained it well?
Yeah, I think so. And that is what we found. Anytime you're talking to an economist about modeling, you get, well, the answer depends on the different assumptions. And what we find is that Site C does still make sense if you have really ambitious decarbonization goals, and if you can build new transmission between Alberta and British Columbia. For exactly the reason you mentioned, Alberta's got this great wind resource. We can get a lot more out of it here if we can buffer it with Site C in BC. But that only works if you're really trying to decarbonize at high rates, and if you can build new transmission. Otherwise, it makes sense to go with something like carbon capture and storage paired with natural gas or something like that.
Well, let's talk about that, because Clean BC does envision very aggressive decarbonization and electrification of the economy. Now, I've looked at a number of electrification studies, and they range generally in around by 2030, we'll need an additional 25,000 gigawatt hours a year, which is about 5 Site Cs. And we're not building any more hydro dams. So that is a real problem for British Columbia that nobody talks about over there. And this might be a potential solution, is to get some of that electricity it'll need. But then on top of that, there's the whole issue of what Alberta's going to do. Now, the Alberta government does not have an aggressive decarbonization plan, but guess what? Justin Trudeau does. As I said in a column earlier this year, the federal steamroller, climate policy steamroller, is about to roll over Alberta, because Alberta is not going to be allowed to get away, just scot-free, and will ignore it for some reason. So it really, it looks to me like there's logic behind building Site C, building out renewables in southern Alberta, making it all part of one system, and then having aggressive decarbonization policies for both provinces.
Yeah, but I think the aggressive decarbonization has to come first, because really without that goal, Site C is a non-starter. So you need aggressive decarbonization in Alberta and BC, and you need cooperation between the systems operators and a strategy for new transmission between the two. Otherwise, some of these other, potentially still fossil fuel, but lower emissions technologies like combined cycle natural gas with carbon capture and storage, stuff like that, that's going to be a more cost-effective way to get that last little bit that you need. I mean, wind and solar are going to play huge parts in this because they are so cheap. But as critics of them are so fond of saying, the wind only blows some of the time, the sun only shines during the day. And so you still do need some of these buffering technologies. And the question is, how far do you want to go in getting carbon out of that part of the generation profile? And Site C really only makes sense if we are very, very keen on getting that carbon out of the system.
Right, but that's where the Trudeau government comes in again, because now we're talking about building more interties between Alberta and BC, and that's a huge, huge capital cost. And if we waited around for the provincial governments or the private sector or the utilities to build it, it would be a long, long time, maybe never get built. It hasn't been built so far. So this might be another, we've got a new infrastructure bank. And this might be a really good role for the infrastructure bank to step up and say, hey, we like this plan with Site C as part of a regional approach to decarbonization. We'll finance that new transmission infrastructure that you need to make that thing work. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, in this paper, we really focused more on what was technologically possible and what the costs were. I think from the policy direction, and this is sort of one of the other hats I wear, it goes back to this idea of better quality linear infrastructure all across Canada, something that we've discussed in the past on the Canadian Northern Corridor concept. But I think absolutely there are huge gains from trade in this country, electricity being an important sector for that. And so thinking more seriously about that strategy, thinking about how you do that from a regulatory perspective, from a consultation perspective, is really important. And so we're stressing that if the BC government wants to go ahead with Site C, they need to be thinking about that as a complementary policy, or in fact an enabling policy to make this cost effective.
My last question here, Kent, is really not an economics issue or a policy issue. It's more of a narrative conversation, which I guess feeds into the policy. And that is, we're not even talking about these issues. And I'm sure that's one of the reasons why you went ahead and you and your colleagues did this paper, is because we need to get these ideas out. We need the policymakers talking about them. We need the public talking about them to put it on the table. Otherwise, we're just in this old binary yes or no kind of scenario. Is fair enough?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so much of the conversation in electricity is about costs and treating, an electron as an electron, which is absolutely true. But how you're getting that electron, whether your generation is dispatchable, what you're doing on these complementary policy issues like transmission, they're all part of this conversation. And so we need to have a broader view of the sector, both from a technical perspective and an economic perspective and a policy perspective. You have to have the whole conversation together.
Yeah, and I'm working on a series of deep dives on this very question. And one of the things that becomes apparent is that the conversation both in Alberta and BC around decarbonization is very, very limited. And when you have limited narratives and limited public conversation, because public conversation is about what becomes politically possible, and when that happens, then you limit your political options, you limit your policy options. And in this case, we need to expand our policy options. So really appreciate this, Kent. Great conversation, and we'll look forward to having you back again, as we always do.
Happy anytime.